Most people know about December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor is one of the most studied, most documented, and most discussed military events in American history. But there is a chapter of that story almost no one talks about. 3 months after the smoke cleared from Battleship Row, Japan came back. They targeted Pearl Harbor a second time. The mission was audacious, the logistics were extraordinary, and the failure was almost comical. And yet, what happened on the night of March 4, 1942, quietly changed the course of the entire Pacific War. To understand why Japan launched a second strike, you have to understand what the first one actually accomplished, and what it didn't. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy hit Pearl Harbor with 353 aircraft launched from 6 carriers. The damage was staggering. 8 American battleships were sunk or damaged. Nearly 2,400 Americans were killed. The attack pulled the United States into World War II overnight. By every measure of spectacle, it was a stunning success. But within the halls of the Imperial Japanese Navy, sober minds were already identifying the cracks in the victory. The American aircraft carriers, the most important vessels in the modern Pacific Fleet, were not at Pearl Harbor that day. The USS Enterprise was returning from Wake Island. The USS Lexington was ferrying aircraft to Midway. The USS Saratoga was on the West Coast. Not one carrier was touched. Not one. There was a second problem. The fuel storage tanks at Pearl Harbor, holding millions of gallons of oil essential to Pacific Fleet operations, were never bombed. Admiral Husband Kimmel, the American commander at Pearl Harbor, later said that had those tanks been destroyed, the fleet might have been forced back to the West Coast. The Japanese had left the engine of American recovery fully intact, and American recovery came fast. Faster than anyone in Tokyo had anticipated. Ships that had been pulled from the harbor floor were already being repaired. Workers were operating around the clock. The Japanese had miscalculated how quickly the United States could adapt, rebuild, and rearm. By early 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy needed answers. How many ships remained at Pearl Harbor? How far along was the repair effort? Were the carriers home? What was waiting for them if a major operation pushed east? Without accurate intelligence, any future strike or major offensive in the Central Pacific would be flying blind. The Vice Admiral of the Fourth Fleet conceived a plan. He called it Operation K. The goal was reconnaissance first, disruption second. 2 aircraft would fly to Pearl Harbor under cover of darkness, survey the base, photograph what they could, and bomb the 1010 dock, the main repair facility, on the way out. If the mission went well, more raids would follow. The aircraft chosen for the mission were Kawanishi H-8K flying boats, designated Emily by Allied forces. These were not small planes. The Emily was a massive 4-engine aircraft, capable of hauling 1 ton of bombs and flying over 3,000 miles on a full tank. It was also heavily armed, carrying 5 20mm cannons and 5 machine guns, earning it the nickname, the Flying Porcupine. Any Allied fighter pilot who thought an Emily was easy prey was quickly corrected. The plan called for 5 of these aircraft. When the time came, only 2 were available. Mechanical problems had grounded the others, so 2 pilots would carry the entire mission. Lieutenant Hisao Hashizumi would command the operation. Ensign Shosuke Sasao would fly the second plane. Both men were personally briefed by the Vice Admiral. They understood the stakes. They also understood the odds. The route itself was insane by the standards of 1942 aviation. The 2 planes would depart Wetje Atoll in the Marshall Islands, fly 1,850 miles to French Frigate Shoals, a remote atoll deep in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. They would then land on the water, refuel from waiting submarines, then fly another 510 miles to Oahu, conduct the mission, and fly all the way home. The entire operation would cover more than 4,700 miles. It would become the longest shore-based bombing mission in the history of the war. One submarine, the I-23, was assigned to lurk off the coast of Oahu, close enough to report on weather conditions over the target, and close enough to rescue any downed airmen if the planes were shot down over the harbor. It was a grim but practical assignment. Then the I-23 disappeared. The submarine never returned from its patrol in February 1942 and was declared lost with all hands. Its cause of sinking remains unknown to this day. The rescue plan was gone. The weather reconnaissance was gone. Hashizumi and Sasao would be flying into Pearl Harbor with no idea what conditions awaited them. There was one more problem. American Navy cryptographers had been working overtime, and the Japanese were well aware of it. In an effort to preserve the element of surprise, the Japanese had been reading U.S. Navy weather codes to get advance intelligence on Hawaiian conditions. But just before the operation launched, the Americans changed those codes. The pilots had no weather data. They had no rescue submarine. They had no fighter escort. They had each other and their orders. On the night of March 3rd, the two Emilys lifted off from Wetje Atoll and headed northeast over open ocean. Hours later, they touched down at French frigate shoals and refueled from the waiting submarines. The operation was still on. Later in the evening, both aircraft were airborne again, turning toward Pearl Harbor. American radar operators did not miss them. Stations on Kauai picked up the inbound contacts while the planes were still far out to sea. The contact was tracked and reported. Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighters were scrambled to intercept. PBY Catalina flying boats were sent out to search for the Japanese carriers that American commanders assumed had launched the two aircraft. Nobody in the American chain of command had yet considered that the planes might have flown all the way from the Marshall Islands. What happened next was determined not by bullets or anti-aircraft guns, but by weather. A thick layer of nimbus clouds had settled over Oahu. The same clouds that hid Pearl Harbor from the Japanese pilots also helped hide the Japanese planes from American defenders. Flying at roughly 15,000 feet, Hashizumi and Sasao could not locate their target. The harbor was somewhere below them, buried under an impenetrable ceiling of cloud. Hashizumi used the Kina Point lighthouse on the northwest tip of Oahu to get a fix on his position. He made a decision. He would attack from the north. He radioed his wingman with the plan and began his run. Sasao never received the order. Whether the radio transmission failed or was missed in the tension of the moment, Sasao turned south, skirting the southern coastline of Oahu. The two planes were now flying in opposite directions over the same island in the dark, with no communication between them. Hashizumi, flying alone and unable to identify Pearl Harbor beneath the clouds, dropped his four 250-kilogram bombs over what he believed to be the target area. The bombs struck the slopes of Tantalus Peak, an extinct volcanic cinder cone just north of Honolulu, somewhere between 2 and 2:15 in the morning. No military installation, no dock, no ships, but a volcano. Sasao, flying his separate path over the southern coast, found himself in the same predicament. Clouds everywhere, no target visible, no communication with his flight leader. Historians believe he eventually dropped his bombs into the ocean, somewhere off the Waianae coast or near the sea approach to Pearl Harbor. Neither bomb struck anything of military significance. There were 0 American casualties. The two planes then turned southwest and flew toward home. The aftermath on the American side was its own kind of chaos. Residents of Honolulu heard the explosions near Tantalus Peak and had no idea what they were. The Army and the Navy began pointing fingers at each other over who was responsible for the mysterious detonations near Theodore Roosevelt High School, which sustained minor damage from the blast. Neither service wanted to explain how Japanese aircraft had reached Oahu uninterrupted. An LA radio station broadcast an unsubstantiated report claiming the raid had caused considerable damage at Pearl Harbor, including 30 sailors and civilians killed and 70 wounded. Japanese state media picked up the report and broadcast it as fact. The Imperial Japanese Navy, eager for a morale victory, did not rush to correct the record. Hashizumi, flying back toward the Marshall Islands, discovered that his plane had sustained hull damage during the water landing at French frigate shoals. The primitive facilities at Midway Atoll were inadequate for repairs. He pushed on, flying non-stop all the way to the main Japanese base deeper in the Marshalls. That solo return leg pushed his total flight time past 36 hours. It was the longest bombing mission in history at that point in the war. Sasao returned to Midway as planned. Both men had survived. Neither had hit their target. The Imperial Japanese Navy reviewed the results and declared Operation K a limited success. Officially, they cited the long-range capability demonstrated by the mission. Unofficially, they had gained almost no intelligence on Pearl Harbor and had done zero damage to American repair operations. It was a failure dressed in the language of achievement, but the consequences of Operation K ran deeper than the bombing mission itself, because the operation set off a chain reaction that would alter the Pacific War permanently. American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had been intercepting Japanese naval communications for months. The activity surrounding French frigate shoals before Operation K had been noticed. The significance had not been fully acted upon in time to prevent the March 4 raid, but the lesson was not forgotten. After Operation K, the U.S. Navy stationed ships permanently at French frigate shoals. The refueling point was denied to the Japanese for the rest of the war. This decision had a direct impact on what came next. In late May of 1942, the Japanese planned a follow-up operation. They wanted to use French frigate shoals again to refuel flying boats that would scout the Hawaiian Islands ahead of a major operation. The objective was to determine exactly where the American carriers were before the Battle of Midway. When Japanese submarines arrived at French frigate shoals to prepare for the refueling, they found American vessels already there. The mission was aborted. Japan went into the Battle of Midway without knowing where the American carriers were. That intelligence gap proved catastrophic. The U.S. Navy, armed with code-breaking intelligence of its own, knew the Japanese were coming. American carriers were waiting. In 4 days of fighting in early June 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers. The offensive power of the Imperial Japanese Navy was broken, and it never recovered. The thread connecting Operation K to the Battle of Midway is not speculation. It is a direct line of consequence. Because Japan flew 2 planes to Pearl Harbor on March 4, 1942 and failed, the United States denied them the refueling base they needed. Because that base was denied, Japan fought Midway blind. Because Japan fought Midway blind, they lost the battle that decided the Pacific War. There is one final footnote that no one expected. After the war, American intelligence officers began piecing together how the Japanese had conceived of the submarine refueling scheme at a remote atoll in the first place. The answer came from an unlikely source. In August 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor, a short story appeared in the Saturday Evening Post. It was written by a naval officer named Jasper Holmes under the pen name Alec Hudson. The story, titled Rendezvous, described American planes refueling from submarines at a remote island to strike a target 3,000 miles away. The U.S. Navy had actually suppressed the story for a year, fearing it described techniques that could compromise national security. Holmes eventually convinced censors the methods were already known to other navies, and the story was published. Rear Admiral Edwin Layton later concluded that the Japanese had almost certainly read the story and used it as the blueprint for Operation K. Japan had essentially lifted an American military fiction story from a popular magazine and turned it into operational planning. 2 planes, 2 pilots, a borrowed idea from a short story, a remote atoll, and a chain of decisions that rippled forward to the most decisive naval battle in the Pacific. That is the story of Operation K. History rarely moves in straight lines. but sometimes it does, and sometimes you can trace exactly where the line was drawn. Subscribe to World War II, Steel and Power for more great stories from this monumental era.